Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast, and my guest today is RPG writer, translator, and antiquarian, I will say, Brian Johnson. Brian has done a number of translation works for real-world magical texts and is otherwise an enthusiast for role-playing games. Brian, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Terry. Thanks for having me.
So, how did you get into two wildly distant things? How did you get into RPGs and maybe eventually Mage the Ascension? And how did you get into translation work?
Okay. Well, I've been playing role-playing games of one sort or another since I was probably about 12 years old and discovered, second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons book at my local Walden Books bookstore. The translation thing, I've always been fascinated by mythology and magic, that kind of thing in general. And I think I've always kind of been interested in getting inside inside of belief systems that I was unfamiliar with, both like across different cultures, different time periods. So I've always been made kind of a hobbyist study of magic practices throughout history in different parts of the world. Gradually, it got to the point where I started, coming across references to some of these texts and manuscripts that I found had never been translated into English. Taking a step back, I took German in high school. I took Koine Greek in college because I actually did my first degree in archaeology of the ancient Near East. So I was studying Greek for that, kind of gave myself a crash course in Latin. I was studying medieval European archaeology. So I had some background in a few different languages. So when I started coming across these texts that weren't available in English, I kind of took it upon myself to translate them just for my own use. Made some progress on that. I thought, this is some pretty interesting stuff. I wonder if other people would be interested in reading it. And I guess that the publisher that I got in contact with agreed. That's the short version.
Is this one of those things where, as a translator, that you kind of start with mastery of a language, or is it something that you pick up as you go? Or kind of what is the relationship between understanding the language, understanding the culture, and understanding the text, if that makes sense?
So starting out, I mean, I am by no means fluent in any of the foreign or historical languages that I work with. I would say basically I have a solid foundation in basic grammar, common vocabulary. After that point, especially with old, medieval and earlier texts, it's kind of like riding a bike, but the bike is different every time. Because there's a lot of very specific and period specific vocabulary. And there's also the matter of this is from a period before normalized spelling, which was not just a problem in vernacular languages. So in Greek and Latin, you come across irregularities in that respect. And also dealing with these are, handwritten manuscripts rather than any kind of a printed text. So something I definitely did kind of have to teach myself as I went was paleography, recognizing these letter forms that don't necessarily look much like they would in a modern printed text. And there are also a ton of semi-standardized abbreviations that you kind of have to learn to recognize. There's actually an entire dictionary of Latin abbreviations from the medieval period that I make frequent use of.
So it sounds like it's not necessarily the process of being an expert in a language so much as willing to become an expert in a given text and being able to say, I am going to ingest as much writing as I can about what was going on at this time. I am going to immerse myself in the orthography of the era. And I mean, this is one of those cases where like we can flippantly say Koine Greek, but like that's a language that was used for 600 years at least, like in common like official use. So like I sometimes have difficulty reading something that was written in the late 19th century, so I presume it's only worse for that. And then on top of that, as you mentioned, that you have inconsistent spelling and you have inconsistent ways in which things are written and different regional ways of discussing something. So it really sounds like when you're translating one of these texts, it is more a willingness to just immerse yourself in a particular text and the era it comes from, more than just being an expert in the language and being able to walk in and translate it like a character in an action movie who's able to just like read a temple inscription. Is that reasonable to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Every one of these translation projects is really a research project into the text, where the particular manuscript came from, if we can find that out at all. And then, especially with the kind of materials I generally work with, at least some amount of research into the magical system and worldview that informed the practices that they were recording.
And is that something where you're looking at other period texts or what other scholarly work? What is the research process for finding the context or milieu of a work? What does that look like?
Yeah, it is a lot of looking at secondary sources, other scholars that have done research into similar materials, and looking at kind of what you might call the genealogical relationship between whichever text I'm looking at and those that came before and after, and how they might have influenced one another, and what kinds of other texts the hypothetical author might have had access to.
Okay, so you may be looking at a text that is making veiled references or allusions to another popular text at the time that we just kind of miss, in the same way that we have liturgical music that we're pretty sure included riffs from popular tunes of the time, but we just don't know what that original song was. But we have an idea that it was there, so we kind of have to infer what was going on around it. Sometimes we can confirm it, but not always. So it sounds like you're dealing with having very few puzzle pieces when you're trying to piece together this puzzle.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. The idea of kind of veiled citations of other contemporary texts, or just even folk magical concepts that were just in the air at the time.
Us not being aware of the water, the ubiquitous ideas that were around at the time. Can we take kind of this whole process and maybe talk about how it could occur in a game? Maybe you have characters that come across a particular text, maybe from an era that you, Brian, are familiar with, and you could say, okay, the characters need to interpret this text to do a thing, and maybe walk through what the mundane steps involved in that could be, and maybe what that could look like in a game. So maybe we have I don't know what particular era you consider yourself most familiar with, but you've mentioned the medieval period. So the characters have this medieval demonology text, which is written in maybe an obscure language of somewhere across the Eurasian continent, that they're like, okay, we're going to need to deal with this thing. What do you think the process would be if a table wanted to get a little bit crunchy and go into the details? How do you think it would go from, we know this book exists, to we've gotten it, to we've translated it, to now we're using it to get rid of the demon?
Yeah, I can give it a shot. I'm betting that you will have a better grasp of the maybe the specific mechanics than I do. I mean, Mage is one of my favorite games, but it's not one that I have a really thorough grasp of the rule system on. The characters have let's say they have the physical manuscript, or a facsimile of it. Probably the first thing they would need to do is find someone who has some grasp of whatever language it's in, whether that's one of the characters themselves or an ally or a contact of some kind. Assuming that the text is, sufficiently legible to easily decipher the language as it's written in the first place, the actual process of translation is not really that difficult. Translating word for word is can be a fairly mechanical process. But as far as rendering it into a sensible, intelligible set of instructions on how to do something is also going to require some degree of familiarity with what the author was trying to accomplish with it in the first place. It's kind of a chicken and the egg situation almost. You have to know what the author was trying to do in order to figure out what they were writing, to figure out the instructions they were writing down as to how to do it. That's going to be kind of a process of making inferences, like I mentioned earlier, based on the historical context, similar types of magical practices that would have been current at the time. So this is going to require some kind of historical knowledge or research on the part of the characters.
They find out that there's this book out there. As an academic, do you ever go through the process of how the heck do I get a copy of this? Is that something where there's like academic politics where someone wants to be the first to comment on something? Or have you found people are generally willing to share?
Less politics and, if anything, more financial consideration, because most of these manuscripts that are going to be in any way available are in either university or in some cases national libraries. And now most of them are very willing to provide a facsimile copy of any kind of a manuscript to researchers, usually for a fee of greater or lesser scale. But increasingly, they're making all kinds of historical manuscripts available in digitized form through their websites. And in fact, that's primary way that I've actually been able to access most of the texts that I've worked on. I'm in the United States, and most of these are in libraries in England, France, or Italy. And especially during COVID lockdown, I'm certainly not flying around the world to do my research.
So it sounds like if we want to have this be somewhat realistic, the three prongs that we could more or less have is, oh, we need the seal of lesser binding, which was included in this particular text or something. One, we can literally Google that. And then it becomes the process of how do we do the translation. Two, it may be something where it's part of a library collection. And they're like, yeah, you're more than welcome. We don't have it digitized yet. You can come and look at it. So now suddenly we do have that around the world jaunt where the characters need to jet off to Nice or something like that, or Bologna or something to do it. And probably someone will be more than willing to share it. I imagine with some of these things, people are absolutely elated that someone else is interested in the same thing that they are.
I'm always excited to find someone to talk about this kind of stuff with, and not just get a blank stare in response.
And then it sounds like there are cases where something is misidentified or something is under lock and key, but at least in the academic world, that seems relatively rare. And maybe that occurs if something is in a private library or if the book itself is very rare or very valuable. I can see someone being like, if it's relatively hard to get touch time with a Gutenberg Bible or something like that, I presume. But it sounds like the number of texts that are just that exist that are just not available to the public is kind of small in comparison. Is that the case? Or
Realistically, yes, they are accessible. You may have to get on some sort of a waiting list, depending on what exactly you're trying to get a hold of.
I like your idea, though, of the waiting list, where suddenly what we expected to be this high-tension Indiana Jones game is actually this game of social and political wrangling. As we're like, hey, can I use the photocopier first? And being like, no, I really need this. And you're like, no, I really need this. And now we have this kind of funny academic moment where mages are just, they thought they would have to go toe-to-toe with a Balrog or something like that. But at the end of the day, what they really need to do is deal with an outdated library administrative system and convincing three people to let them grab the tome they need before somebody else. And I think that is interesting in that it seems both realistic and something fun that could happen in a mage game.
Yeah, absolutely. One that I had just recently had published. I was working with a manuscript from the Laurentian Library in Florence, Italy. Its catalog title seems to describe it as a work dealing with geomancy. which was a form of divination that was popular in the Renaissance period. Actually, looking in it, there are only maybe one or two pages out of 600 or so that are actually about geomancy. And the overwhelming majority of the text is actually about demon conjuration.
Oh, wow. Again, that sounds like a very mundane concern is going to be tracking down experts, maybe getting someone to reclassify something. It would be like scholars centuries from now having to definitively pick one category for the movie Back to the Future. Is it comedy? Is it sci-fi? Is it what have you? And that seems like it can be quite hard. Are libraries organized by topic, by geography? Like, is there a general way in which collections are made, or is it just kind of scattershot?
That's another difficulty. It really is kind of scattershot. And this kind of connects with the cataloging problem because many of these manuscripts of all kinds, and especially ones that have any kind of what we would recognize as magical content, are often just miscellanies. They are just the personal notebooks of people in all different kinds of social positions and stations in life. So you'll have everything from, demon conjuration to home remedies all in the same bound manuscript. So more often than not, they are going to have a catalog number rather than any kind of a really descriptive title to go by. So it's almost a matter of relying on archival researchers that are investigating a particular library archive for whichever topic to discover these things in the first place, and then hopefully make mention of them in their publications for other scholars to find.
And that kind of seems interesting. Your note that a lot of these were just kind of personal notebooks to be like the characters are trying to find the seal of greater warding, which is supposedly tied to this thing. And they find out it's just the personal notebook of some guy from the 8th century. And it includes notes on how to properly prepare a goose and what the weather was like. And it is just very, I guess you could say, first person in terms of it is maybe not something that the author intended to share with anyone else, so it is highly idiomatic. And that, if we want to have our globe-trotting adventure, is where that starts, where someone says, oh, I found out that this wood from this particular yew tree was particularly good at creating this kind of dowsing rod or something. And now if you want to have that globe-trotting adventure, that's kind of an easy way to jam it in. What do these books, in a lot of cases, actually look like? Like, I am familiar with the precursor to the modern book, the Codex, which is a bunch of sheets of vellum. What are some interesting forms that these books took before we kind of came across our modern agreement on how a book looks?
A lot of them really are just those big leather collections of sheets of vellum. I mean, if certainly going back a bit farther before the medieval period to what we might call late antiquity up through the 4th, 5th century in Egypt. Of course, we have the Greek magical papyri, which as they exist now are largely just fragments that scholars and archaeologists have to struggle to piece back together. But they were originally, of course, long papyrus scrolls. Like I say, in the medieval period, the Renaissance, they were mostly in what would look like a book to us, either in with sheets of vellum or parchment, or a little bit later, getting into the Renaissance, you come across paper more often. They were, more often than not, notebooks for the personal use of whoever put them together, and that goes back to the handwriting issue, where they were not putting these things together expecting that anyone else would ever have to try to read them. So deciphering the handwriting is one thing. And then as for the actual material that's recorded in them, the instructions as such are not always as complete as a modern practitioner might hope for, because a lot of the background assumptions about how to do certain things, the author wasn't going to put those down because they were, common knowledge. You don't need to remember how to prepare a certain kind of ink or a certain combination of incense because he's done it 100 times before. in your game of Mage, that's certainly a challenge and a hazard that the characters might encounter, some missing implicit instructions in their ritual.
So one of those things where in this particular time period when you were doing a pentacle, of course you always started at this corner and made your way clockwise or something like that, or of course you used standard iron gall ink, or of course you would only write this on wood pulp taken from a poplar tree or something like that. So that those may be details that a character needs to fill in. As you mentioned, these were not instruction manuals. These were not intended for other people to use them. Was there a point where that changed? Like, for instance, I hear things like the Egyptian Book of the Dead and so on, or holy text, for instance, seem to be written with the intent that they would be shared around, kind of. Is there a point where the nature of magical writing shifts, or does it continue to be a mix even up until current times?
I think if there was a turning point, it may have been during the Renaissance when you begin to see more patronage of scholarship. People like the Medici family began paying for scholars to make translations of the things like the Corpus Hermeticum and other Greek Neoplatonic texts mixed in with all of the highbrow philosophical material would also be practical magical texts. At that point, they're making these translations for their wealthy patrons. They certainly would they'd be put together in something more like a presentation copy.
Okay, so that is maybe the original text plus some notes and some marginalia and commentary on it, or is a presentation copy kind of something different?
I think it would vary. I mostly just mean the handwriting would be sufficiently legible
Oh, okay.
for someone other than the author to read.
As you mentioned, there's kind of this change that starts happening in the Renaissance where people are translating text so that they can be viewed by other people. When we think of magical texts, at least in the Western world, what are kind of some of the key pieces that come to mind? You had made mention to the Corpus Hermeticum. What's that?
What is called the Corpus Hermeticum, that's not actually exactly a magical text, although the texts that it comprises were certainly transmitted with magical texts. It's basically a system of Neoplatonic philosophical religion that also incorporates some elements of ancient Egyptian religion that was popular and transmitted in the first couple of centuries CE in the Greco-Roman world. It was one of the popular what you might call mystery religions in around the Mediterranean at that time. We call the Corpus Hermeticum, the corpus of religious and philosophical writings that are attributed to the quasi mythological figure of Hermes Trismegistus.
And when we think of Neoplatonism, it's not so much a philosophical school necessarily, so much as kind of a chain of philosophical schools that kind of emerged in what is the first few centuries of the Common Era from Hellenistic philosophy and just kind of got developed and refined over time, that just kind of has this notion that there are different emanations or different forms of the world, and that there are certain forms out in nature that we can consider that there is kind of this divine origin, this simple, ineffable something out there, whether or not it's conscious, we don't know, that there are emanations that come out of it that create a sequence of lesser beings, and that there is kind of this difference between the divine and the profane, for lack of a better term, that there's some kind of hierarchy, that evil is just kind of the absence of good, seemingly more so than anything else. Is there anything key to have in mind when we think of Neoplatonism, and what differentiates a magical text from a philosophical text?
I would say that was an excellent summary. Neoplatonic philosophy, the like as you say, the idea that everything basically emanates from God or the One. It's referred to differently, and because of that, everything down in the sublunar material world, because it all can be traced back up the chain of being to a common origin, is all connected with interconnected in one way or another, and that basically forms the rationale for magic, because everything down here is connected in one way or another. That's how things can be influenced at a distance by manipulating something in one place that bears a kind of, metaphysical similarity to a thing in another place.
So it kind of sounds like the philosophy is the why, and the magic is kind of the how. That one is making a statement of this is how the world works, and the magical aspect is saying this is how you change things, or this is how you do things. So it sounds like those things were probably often kind of tied together. When you think of magical texts or ancient texts that can be mined for ideas in a mage game, is there anything that you recommend, or anything that comes to mind has enough scholarship around it that a table can use it without necessarily needing to learn linear B or something like that?
It's a huge topic. We're looking at basically all the whole of Western Eurasian history here that we have to pick from. But there are, going all the way back to Babylon, I mean, there are ancient Mesopotamian texts that have in fact been, edited and translated in modern scholarly editions, that you can, go to the library and see what kinds of spells were being used in 1000 BCE. You find a lot of apotropaic or defensive magic. A lot of magic in all periods of history is generally focused on a rather small number of common concerns that kind of boil down to love, money, revenge, and health. You're going to find magic is done for pretty much the same purposes throughout history, and even the methods don't really change a whole lot. I mean, the particular window dressing of the ritual steps you need to go through will vary from culture to culture, but the basic concepts of manipulating an assemblage of materials that are in one way or another believed to have certain qualities or magical virtues, you might say, that have some kind of relationship to the object of the operation, that forms the basic framework for most magic down through history. Trying to get back to your answering your question of what kind of texts are available, I can certainly provide some links to these for you to include in the show notes. But there are, like I say, there are editions of everything from ancient Mesopotamian anti-demon protective rituals. A little bit later, we've already mentioned the Greek magical papyri, which are a huge collection of magical texts for a variety of purposes, like as I say, the common everyday concerns, but also things like making contact with a god or a familiar spirit. And the scholarly consensus at present seems to be that these were most likely property of people who had formerly been priests in some of the Egyptian temples in the first few centuries of the Common Era, but around the time that Christianity was taking hold throughout the Roman Empire, many of these temples were being forcibly closed, and the priesthood basically found themselves out of a job and were turning to more of a kind of freelance operation. These texts were more or less their own personal notebooks of instructions for various ritual operations that clients may approach them for. If we go a few centuries after that, we begin seeing things like there's a text called Picatrix, which was translated from Arabic into Latin around the 13th century. And what this is a collection of various kinds of largely astrologically based magic that we can trace back to some of the principles of Hellenistic Greek astrological theories that had been transmitted from the Mediterranean all the way to India and back through Persia and the Arabian Peninsula between late antiquity and around the 10th century or so, and kind of form a synthesis of Greco-Roman and Neoplatonic and pagan pre-Islamic Arabian magical and religious concepts that, as I say, were finally transmitted back into the Western world in the Middle Ages. And all of these have been edited and translated and are available to modern English readers.
And it seems interesting. Like you've thrown a bunch out there that I kind of want to walk through and say how we can jam this into a mage game. So you bring up apotropaic magic, which is just the idea of, I mean, it literally means what, to ward off or to turn away or something. And it's the idea that the Greeks were making offers to averting gods, these entities that would grant safety. So I can see this thing where a particular entity or a particular bad thing, you would always do this particular act in the ancient world to get rid of it. It has laid dormant for centuries, and that practice is gone. And now your characters are suddenly dealing with this potent demon or negative force, and they need to convince a society to start doing this particular thing again. So suddenly your characters need to convince maybe an entire city that on one particular day of the year that they all need to burn a sprig of thyme or something in their house, or to do a particular dance step, or to sing a particular song. And now your characters are in the position that they need to find a way to accept this massive pop cultural idea. It is also interesting to me in that warding magic is interesting in that the further back you go in magic, the more one weird tricks there are. So we have the echoes flaws in contemporary games, which are cases where a character can't cross a threshold or needs to be invited in, or these throwaways from folk magic. But if you're dealing with truly ancient entities and truly ancient magic, it is more and more likely that those things are going to be in there. And suddenly this thing that has 14 soak dice just so happens that it can always be injured by hawthorn wood, because that is just this ancient magical weaving that is baked into its kind of essence that people have figured out. Or the creature can only be injured by people wearing like the stylized symbol used to avert the evil eye or something like that, or a creature that has the ability to doom people by mere looking. But the tools of averting that harm were so common that it never became a problem. And now your characters are on a quest to rediscover that and contextualize it and be like, oh, this thing was actually so common that no one ever bothered to write it down. So now we need to do this other thing. And you kind of mentioned the Greek magical papyri, which you can get on Amazon, like if you would like a translation of it, that's there. And the thing that kind of jumped out to me about the Greek magical papyri is it provides an interesting reinterpretation of like the Greek gods, where they are kind of portrayed as these dangerous demonic creatures, as opposed to like the aristocrats of heaven that we know. And I think just kind of that reframing is a fascinating practice or idea that a mage can encounter. Maybe you have this sect of early Christian mages who have preserved these practices, where to them, Zeus is a lecherous demon, not this thunderbolt throwing king. And you mentioned the Picatrix, and that's another case where like you had this fascinating round trip, and it just shows how the idea of there being an established canon for a culture seemingly is a modern invention, even within a group where we think everyone kind of agreed on how things were presented. There was always going to be a sect that disagreed with it, or a region that wasn't so thoroughly connected. So if you want to take an existing mythology and then just mash it up with something else to get something new, to have, let's say, a sect of characters that worship Mayan gods, but instead of communing through sacrifice, they do it through food or song or dance or something else, or sacred geometry. That probably existed, and we just don't have it written down. So the sheer amount of space that you have, like looking over the things that you have mentioned, I am still having difficulty with the fact that you're like, oh no, this book was in common circulation for 6 centuries. There are probably dozens of variants that have come across. So I just wanted to interrupt and be like, oh man, just from what you've mentioned so far, these are some of the texts, some of the ideas that come to me for story ideas. So you left off with the Picatrix, which is what, 10th century or 14th century or something like that. Is there anything else that you think should be part of a common in the armory of a storyteller that is pretty easy to get access to?
The later you go, the more has been preserved, of course, and also the more variants you begin to come across. Like there are probably hundreds of manuscripts, both published and not, that call themselves the Key of Solomon or the Secrets of Solomon, because attributing your work to the most famous sorcerer king in Western Christendom was a good selling point.
So it sounds like we could encounter a game where someone says you need to find the Greater Key of Solomon, and there's 30 of them.
Yeah, absolutely. The version of the Key of Solomon that you're probably going to find in most bookstores today, that was translated by MacGregor Mathers in the 19th century, is an edition that was cobbled together from several different versions in the Paris Library. The idea that is presented to modern readers that these texts existed with the way we expect a book to exist, with a particular title corresponding to a particular text. There was no such thing. There were a certain kind of text with a descriptive title of the kind of material that they contained. So you're going to, they were more like genres than particular texts, is what you're going to encounter.
So it sounds like, let's take the Key of Solomon and run from it. Some immediate plot ideas that come to me are, one, maybe the NWO has purposefully obscured the true Key of Solomon, that there is this best version that contains great inherent magic, but the craft masons at the time, their predecessors, are like, we can't let this get out. So they have made subtle modifications to it, and maybe there are some very ancient copies of it from the early 14th century or something like that, that guess that doesn't quite count as ancient, but that have that particular bit of magic that you need. And maybe someone has stumbled upon it, and you have this marauder which is distributing them, and suddenly mortals are controlling powers that they shouldn't. Or alternatively, they need to recover that original copy to bar some sort of entity, or to do some great rite or ritual, or set something true in the world. There could also be kind of a war between mystics to sabotage each other's copies, more or less, to be like, hey, you have this Key of Solomon that is being sold to the public. There is another interpretation of this that I want to be part of the Ascension conflict. I am going to try and propagate my different version. And now literally it is a marketing push to get your Key of Solomon or something to be more popular in the public mind for whatever reasons. What is the Key of Solomon? What's the TLDR on that one?
Like I say, it's basically like I said, there are a number of different versions going by that title, but what they all have in common is basically a framework for constraining spirits that are usually characterized as demons by invoking the power of God and his angels to empower the magician with their authority to constrain these nasty spirits, generally for the purpose of doing the magician's bidding. A couple things that you mentioned are actually interesting, because the idea of these competing texts that differ only in very small details, that's really the kind of thing that many contemporary scholars in the real world get really excited about, discovering these new manuscripts that just have very tiny differences between them that wouldn't really mean a whole lot to anyone who hadn't spent years already studying this kind of thing.
We have this Key of Solomon that is working around. Do you think that in the world of Mage there is I guess you could say, an awakened version of it, like a truer version that is kicking around? Like, how do you think a actual awakened mage would wind up using a popular or well-known text? Is it a case where it's like, hey, we've been able to de-obscure this particular bit, or we've looked with our special eyes and we have found this other thing? My other thought is this is something that would be very potent within the hands of a hollower, taking advantage of that pop culture understanding to do magic unto itself. How do you think a practitioner would actually use it?
Like you say, there are a couple different ways you could approach it. But if you wanted to look at it less from invoking the pop cultural zeitgeist that kind of surrounds the text as it's sold in bookstores, and look more to what was in the original manuscripts, something that might set it apart for a quote unquote true mage rather than a mortal dabbler. A lot of this sort of magic, it relies on knowing the particular correct names of the spirits you're dealing with. So there could you could say there may be a manuscript out there that has the original unredacted names of the spirit you're trying to either invoke or constrain, and without those names, the magic just isn't going to work. It's like it would be like dialing a wrong number
Mm.
otherwise.
So maybe there is an awakened version that has the true name of the entity we're trying to do, or the particular invocation that is baked into its essence that will bar it from reality, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
When we are looking at these texts, is there anything we need to keep in mind? Because there seems to kind of be this arbitrary line where we consider something to be a sacred text versus a user manual of magic. I can perfectly see a character using bibliomancy or something like that, but if another character's divination were to involve cutting up copies of the Quran, for instance, I would be uncomfortable with that being at my table. Do you have any guidelines on, if you're going to introduce a magical or sacred text into a game, on how to do that respectfully, or at least how to do your homework to know how contemporary practitioners treat the text itself?
The whole problem of appropriation is definitely a consideration. The way I approach it, and I think the safest way when we're dealing with what we recognize as magical rather than specifically religious or liturgical texts, is to try to treat them in the same way that contemporary practitioners regarded them. Like just looking at the Greek magical papyri, for example, it's obvious that they draw upon a wide range of different mythologies, everything from the Greek gods to various names of the Hebrew and Christian God side by side. They certainly weren't regarding the various faiths they encountered in their contemporary milieu as closed practices, regardless of how members of those particular religions may have felt about that. So I think it's always been kind of a complicated issue, but I think that as magic per se, rather than as any kind of a devotional practice, magic has always been kind of porous in that regard. It's kind of cherry picked anything that it came across that seemed like it might be able to bestow some kind of supernatural power upon a practitioner. I think it definitely is in the modern world safer for us to, if we want to do that kind of cherry picking, to reach back into history to find things that might be able to lend a kind of exoticism to our game rather than looking to still living traditions that we do not belong to.
Is this something where instead of saying, hey, the Key of Solomon is a thing that's out there, but actually my mages follow the Key of Rehoboam, or to more or less just kind of fabricate something new and kind of sidestep that issue? Or do you think it really adds heft to a game to use something that exists in our world?
I think you could certainly go either way with that. I mean, I think this is really the kind of thing, and with dealing with real world cultural materials of any kind at the gaming table, I think it's really going to have to come down to the individual gaming group and what you and your friends are comfortable with. I really don't think that there can be any kind of a hard and fast rule. Then I'm certainly not the one to tell others how to play their games.
Are there any particular paradigms in the game that you think texts tie to well?
I think it's interesting how these magical texts, even though they rarely spell out the practitioner's own cosmological assumptions, they can almost always be read carefully to infer what some of those assumptions were, which is to say, in game terms, what kind of a paradigm they were operating under. If you have a text where the magician is invoking spirits of one sort or another, you can look at what kind of a relationship does it seem that they are trying to establish here? Is it transactional, like doing I do you a favor, you do me a favor, or is it something more coercive, like we find in texts like the various Keys of Solomon we were discussing? In either case, you might be able to fit this kind of a practice into what's called the World of Gods and Monsters paradigm from M20. Alternatively, if they take more of a more humble and pious attitude toward the spirits, like we see in various forms of Neoplatonic theurgy, or even later in the Renaissance with John Dee and his scrying conversations with angels. It might be more appropriate for the divine order and earthly chaos, or the creation is innately divine and alive paradigms. Or if we come across the kind of astrologically based magic like we find in the Picatrix, where the practitioner has to pay attention to things like very precise astrological timing, and even things like making sure that they're citing the planetary aspects correctly from a particular geographic longitude to make sure everything aligns correctly. This would certainly fit into the mechanistic cosmos paradigm.
We would be not maging correctly if we talked about books and we did not mention the Hermetics. Are there any books that to you kind of scream out Hermeticism or something like that? And also kind of like, what to you is Hermeticism?
If you compare the Order of Hermes as it's presented in the game materials, the philosophical background certainly does derive from the Corpus Hermetica we were discussing earlier, the kind of very broad Neoplatonic cosmology of emanation and sympathetic interconnections. But the fact of the matter is, most magic in Western Europe for the past 2,000 years has been based on those same principles. So a hermetic could very easily draw upon just about anything we've talked about today.
It's kind of interesting that you talk about it being this idea of sympathetic connection, but whenever I see that in the wild, I immediately think of the verbena. So it just sounds like that was an idea that was very ubiquitous in magical thought across a very wide area for a pretty long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. The verbena are kind of doing very much the same kind of magic that the hermetics do, just without writing it down.
So you could say that the verbena understanding of it is much more embodied than maybe a more scholastic or instructional form that the Hermetics may have taken?
Absolutely. It's doing the same thing, but it's really just a difference in structuring it in such a way that it can be remembered orally rather than without a lot of very precise details that need to be transmitted in text.
Is there a reasonable way that we can have magical texts for groups that do not have the same kind of orthographic written tradition? Like, is it reasonable to have something like a book that is sacred to dream speakers or the Wulong or something like that, that may take on less of an instruction manual form, but may still provide something useful to players? Do you have any idea what that could look like?
It's going to depend because, like, some of those traditions, capital T or lowercase t traditions, if they did have some kind of a textual tradition, then those texts very well may be available in some of a modern edition and translation for modern readers. If not, as we were discussing with the European folk traditions that are kind of represented by the verbena, or indigenous religions from all around the world that kind of get lumped into the dream speakers. There was not a ritual text as such, so we really do have to kind of rely on secondary sources, which unfortunately in many of those cases, at least historically, derived from the records of people who were trying to wipe out those traditions, like various, if not inquisitors, then at least evangelizing church officials who were trying to convert the population. But even so, if we approach them with a sufficiently critical eye and the kind of contextual background material that modern historians are able to provide to kind of to frame this material, we can make inferences as to what their practices may have actually looked like at the time. And there are a few cases of contemporary documents. Just for one example, there's a book dealing with the confessions of a an avowed witch. The I believe 17th century Scotland, Isabel Gowdy, that appears to very straightforwardly discuss the kinds of fairly malicious cursing and other magical practices that were being conducted at the time.
So it sounds like we can use these secondhand sources and we just kind of understand that there is a lens that's being cast upon it. And this is something that, at least in a pop cultural lens, we have gotten better at. You have new books like The Fifth Sun that basically say everything written about the Aztecs was from the Spanish point of view. What happens if we do a little more scholarship and kind of peel away that layer on top of it? Or Gnosticism, most of the information about it was written by people who hated Gnosticism. So you kind of have to work backwards to infer something. And the other thing that kind of comes to mind is, so there's this process where, yes, you may have texts, they point in certain directions, but we do not believe the writer. So maybe your characters have to do some sort of deciphering to figure out what portions are real and which parts are just kind of propaganda. And the other thing that kind of comes to mind when we think of other groups is there are traditions where texts are part of a contemplative tradition, where the point of the text is not that it be plainly readable, and the translation and interpretation is the point. I think about tools like koans or Eastern Christian labyrinths. The point is the process, not the destination, as opposed to other places where it's like, we just need the true name. So there are more than one way to parse the notion of what is the job of a book or what is the job of a piece of text.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we were saying with the relationship between the Corpus Hermeticum as philosophical and mystical religious texts, and what are often called the practical Hermetica of the magic spells, more or less. Those are definitely distinct kinds of texts, but they were often transmitted in the very same manuscripts. They were being used by the same people for different purposes, but they were definitely all part of the same paradigm, you might say.
On kind of those circles of extant real-world magical texts and their interpretation and considerations for using them in the game table, is there anything else that you feel that people should know before they start that process of maybe introducing the Corpus Hermeticum or the Key of Solomon into their game?
That really goes to the question of doing your either your own, referring to someone else's historical research to kind of provide that context.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of a maybe an ancient view of the world that we as modern folk would just find mind-blowing?
It's tricky because a lot of the period that I really work with, it actually is not that alien. The thing that you do, or I do have to keep in mind, is that all of these medieval and Renaissance demonological texts that I largely deal with, despite the content and the avowed purposes of a lot of these operations, which are generally not very nice things, the people writing them were all thoroughly Christian. And in fact, it was their understanding of the power of God and his angels that they were invoking in these operations that made them work in the first place. So I mean that's just one example of understanding the mindset that kind of underpins the practical mechanics of a particular form of magic that may not be immediately obvious just from the text itself.
Is there anything for people who find this absolutely fascinating? How do you get started doing it?
Honestly, it was just a hobby. Like I said at the beginning, I started coming across references to these texts in my personal reading of secondary scholarly sources on magic from this period, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and get some more details, and I just found that the material had not already been made available in English, so I just kind of went to it.
Are there any projects you're working on now that you would like to share, or anything you're particularly excited about, or maybe even changes that have happened in the field over the last few years that you just kind of think are interesting?
We are in the midst of a little renaissance of translations of newly uncovered manuscripts in the last 5 years or so, it seems, and it is continuing. Besides my own work, there are a lot of people I could name drop.
But as you mentioned, new documents are coming in line all the time, and with digital resources, those are making their way around the world, I imagine, quite quickly. Are we still in an era where things like the Nag Hammadi Library are being discovered? And do you think that's one of those things where we might be on the cusp of revolutionizing our understanding of a period of history or ancient practice and belief?
The context of the Nag Hammadi text and things like that. On one hand, you have archaeological discoveries like that, and things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I believe just recently a new collection of those was recently discovered. So I think we certainly are. And then on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, archival discovery is a whole other kind of endeavor that often does just kind of depend upon lucky happenstance stumbling across these manuscripts that often don't have a very descriptive catalog title. I'm certain that there is a lot more out there to be discovered. As for my own work that I can speak to, I am working in collaboration with a couple of other scholars on a few different projects that I won't say a whole lot about the details right now because it's not just my own work, but I can confidently say that readers can expect to see a few new translations from me in the pipeline before too long.
Nice. And just for background, the Dead Sea Scrolls were a collection of ancient Jewish and Hebrew religious manuscripts that were found near the Qumran caves in the Judean desert. The Nag Hammadi Library was notable for being discovered, I think, in the mid-50s as part of what was thought to be a midden, just kind of this discarded thing that part of it was ultimately, I think, burned to start cooking fires, but turned out to have some alternative takes, as it were, on early Christianity. It lists Mary Magdalene as the companion of Jesus, which had a lot of monocles falling out, but that kind of Gnostic tradition or reinterpretation is far from new. It was just, it had been a while since we had gotten new texts. So one, you were still doing active work. Two, I think it's interesting in that there's a really interesting angle in our games for more, we could say, techno-bibliomancy, of it no longer just being an archaeological question of somebody to fit together all the pieces that we found and collate hundreds of manuscripts across disparate sources that may be improperly identified. So it seems really easy to have a group in your game that just does that, and more or less as a group that just kind of hands out plot threads. That's like, hey, we found this weird thing in this odd place that was miscategorized or something like that. For people interested in following your work, where can they do that?
I'm most active on Twitter, where I generally discuss as much as I can any new projects or just interesting things I've come across. I'm at JOHBRI. My professional website, where people can find links to all of my publications and those that I have done editing work for, and also get in contact with me if they would like to, is bjohnsonfreelance.com. And that's about all of my public facing places on the internet.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Mage, the podcast, where someone talking about having to cobble together a text from 30 different sources to get something coherent really speaks to us. Maybe too much. This episode has longer than usual show notes that Brian provided, and they are available on our webpage. Our show is made possible by our executive producers, and those supporters are Alex, Andrews S., Andrew Edelstein, Andy, Berto, Boo, Boogers to the Six, Brad of the Blue, Brendan Morrill, Bryce Perry, Chris Sack, Dan Svensson, Dennis Osborne, Entropy Prime, Freddie, Garga Lenoir, Guy Conan Stewart, Isabel Castillo, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Waugh, Jenna F., John Horton, John Magnuson, Josh Golden, Josh Hillerup, Josh Heath, Carl Halperin, La Bull, Leslie Weatherstone, Lexiconjurer, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nabero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick Mulder, Ralph Scheinhammer, Richard Bat Brewster, Ryan Hilton, Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, William Connolly, William Martin, W. Starter, and our Oracle backers, John Widener, Oracle of the Laurentian Library, Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the Florence Baptistry, and Buck Farmer, Oracle of the Medici Chapel. They're all neighbors. Our executive producer shout-out is to Boo, whose name I'm not sure if it is Boo or Bo or Buh. I like their name because it can also be pronounced B-O, which brings me back to my days doing lab chemistry to find better ways to absorb odors. I'm an actuary now, but every time I smell hideous body odor or someone rips a particularly heinous fart, I think of what my life could have been like if I had kept to the stinky path rather than the mathy path. Boo, Bo, Buh, B.O. Thanks for this moment of reflection, and thank you for your support. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop and Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes on all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.